So welcome to our talk, which is called Designing, Implementing, and Testing Microinteractions in Drupal. I am one of your co-hosts, Chelsea Johnston, and I'm joined by...
I'm Molly, and I'm on the creative team.
So I do want to note before we get started that it would be really cool if you have any questions. I think like someone was saying earlier, go ahead and post them in the chat, or feel free to just raise your hand and we'll try to take them. I think we should have time to answer questions during and also after, so cool.
All right, so what are microinteractions? This is kind of a new term, I think, and it does have a definition though, following, but it's kind of a new term to describe certain parts of motion design. So this is from Nielsen Group. Microinteractions are trigger feedback pairs in which, one, the trigger can be a user action or an alteration in the system state, or the feedback is a narrowly targeted response to the trigger and is communicated through small, highly contextual, usually visual changes in the user interface.
So all too often, project teams and stakeholders and anyone involved in building web things, I think it's easy for us to write off microinteractions as being kind of bells and whistles or icing on the cake. But we shouldn't do that. Microinteractions can be really, really helpful in creating a user experience and sort of a feel of using a site that is pleasant and elegant and delightful. And we can also use microinteractions to help guide users in their journey to finding the information that they want to find, which is the whole point of the web. So microinteractions won't break the experience if they're missing necessarily, but they can really elevate it in a way that I think would be a shame for people to continue writing off. And also these days, it's more and more expected, especially if you're building a design system or like a pattern library, that you consider microinteractions and things like motion design. If you're working from a place of building smaller components that then get reused in larger components, it kind of can get baked into your process that you're thinking about those microinteractions earlier, which is really cool because then, you know, when you plug your button into your interface, it already has the effect that it needs or whatever it is. So let's talk about how we can extend the efficacy of microinteractions to be more than just about aesthetics, and how we can make lasting functional impacts so that you and your team can create winning web projects. The goals for this session are learning objectives. We want to understand why and where it makes sense to implement microinteractions. We want to brainstorm how to consider accessibility throughout, especially at the beginning, but also making sure that we're checking in throughout. And we want to explore some ideas and some snippets for implementing motion design across your things that you are building.
All right, so why and where does it make sense to implement microinteractions? To figure out where we should implement microinteractions, let's talk about some of the benefits for the end users, designers and developers on your team, and your company. So the big overarching rule is that microinteractions should be meaningful and they should be driven by the user experience. Going back to that icing on the cake thing, they're a lot more effective and a lot more elegant if you think of them as something that's going to enhance the user experience rather than just something that'll make it look good or look cool. So it needs to inform the user on what to expect when they hover over. You need to make sure that they are logical matching movements so that it feels unified, and that each interaction has consistent results and expectations. So you can see here, there are some GIFs I pulled from a site that Chelsea and I had worked on, and you can see that the line weight and the left to right motion is the same, and you can tell that both those things would be things that you would click on and expect an interaction or a next page from. right. And there are some ways to take that. Obviously, you want to make sure that all those rules still apply, but there are also ones that just, you know, can visually enhance the user experience in addition to informing the user about what is going to happen. So obviously, you know that a call to action button is clickable. You know it's going to take you somewhere, but you can see here that we've matched that left to right motion on mouse over. So it all feels unified, not necessary. It could have just changed color, could have been a normal old hover state. But bringing that expected motion and that consistency of direction really kind of enhanced the experience of the whole page overall. Another thing we did was the site that we were referencing here had a lot of components that felt very similar. And so in that bottom left-hand GIF, you can kind of see as you scroll, the images slide in from whatever side that they're on. And so that's a good way to identify a new section, a new product, a new idea. And the iPhone screenshot I have here is actually from Shopify. Their design system is really revered in that world. And they have a whole page called Experience. And in it, it shows things like this, how it's supposed to feel, the timing, the ease. It's all very deliberate and elegant. And they just do a really good job defining that. And as Chelsea mentioned before, this is very important to include as part of your design system. And you know, this is all new, but we're figuring out ways to include that right from the start, as she said. So everybody's on the same page and moving that left in the process.
Yeah, so I will point out one thing just quickly about this bottom left example about the things sliding in from the left. So this was a theme where one of the requirements, it was a Drupal site, and one of the requirements was that the content editors could, if you've worked in Drupal and you'd use the paragraphs module, we used that to allow the content editors to add.
Allergen can also be.
What's that? We used the paragraphs module to allow people to make kind of a, like, to be able to build block by block what they wanted from a set of predefined components. And the challenge there was making sure that the motion design kind of remained interesting in some pages where they ended up just being the same component over and over again. So that was one way that being able to do that kind of at the individual component level kind of gained us a lot of mileage there.
All right, and that is not to say that you can't just have fun with this. This is something I pulled from CodePen, this neat little hover effect. But I think, you know, Last Call Media has done it on our website. We have this Yeti character that we use throughout, and you know, we have him flying around on the homepage, which is obviously not necessary, not informing anything other than that. You know, that's our personality, and it can speak volumes about your brand, your site. And, you know, as long as those things are managed correctly, as far as accessibility, as we're going to get into soon, they can just be a super fun way to play with the internet and show what you can do. So yeah, this pizza tacos thing, I really thought was great.
So let's talk about accessibility in the context of microinteractions and motion design. It is really important to consider accessibility throughout your project anyway, but especially if you are introducing things like motion design. It's just the responsible thing to do. And in order to be responsible about it, you have to think about it from the very beginning and test throughout, kind of like I said earlier, to make sure principles are being adhered to. And that's sort of being called, I think in the industry today, like a shift left approach to testing, but in particular, a shift left approach to accessibility testing is kind of the prudent way to go about this. So for a few recent projects, we've been lucky enough at Last Call to be able to partner with the Carroll Center. They've been a really invaluable resource in auditing our work, not only for accessibility compliance, but also for ease of use. There is so much more to accessibility than many of us think, and people use the web in all sorts of different ways. So it's more than just, you know, making sure that someone can navigate through your site with a keyboard, or that your color contrast is high enough. There's a million and one accessibility checklists available online, but there's no substitute for a subject matter expert or users who rely on accessibility and websites adhering to accessibility really well and being thoughtful about it in order to navigate the web and find what they need to find and do what they need to do. So we worked with the Carroll Center on a few projects now and had them check in with us, or checked in with them rather, kind of at the beginning of the project and throughout, and also at the end, just to make sure that we are doing things properly and that our stuff is usable by different people. And it was really cool. They were able to give us some reports and really specific things to change that were big wins for us. So that's really neat. They're certainly not the only expert out there. I don't know about all the experts out there, but I really recommend that project teams consider doing something like this, especially if you don't have an in-house accessibility expert, or even if you do, because like I said, accessibility comes in so many different forms. And I think just relying on like one person or one checklist is not as good as, you know, having a broader understanding, a broader and deeper understanding if possible. On the right, I listed some libraries where some really awesome people have come together and created sort of patterns and code examples for how to do certain things accessibly. And there are some really good write-ups here if you go to these links, and we will make the slides available afterward. So you can also find these online, obviously. In particular, the accessibility project, that top one, we've used pretty heavily to make sure that, so for example, let's say we need to design a checkbox that looks more than just the default checkbox. Since we're talking about microinteractions, you know, we want it to not look just like the default browser element, but kind of have some personality. But in doing that, if, you know, developers in the room might be familiar with the practice of like ripping out that DOM element and making a fake new one that looks the way you want. But obviously the drawback of doing that is that you lose the native functionality of that element, which is what a lot of accessibility tools rely on. So these libraries will kind of come and meet in the middle between those two requirements. And just people have put a lot of thought into this stuff, and it's really, really valuable to check this stuff out. So another way that we can keep accessibility in mind is through providing opt-outs. So the ability to stop animations, for example, a pause button for motion sensitive users. So on this top site, this top banner here, this was a corporate site where they had a video playing in the background, autoplay when you load the page. It kind of fades in, and it was really theatrical and looked pretty cool. And certainly this is a trend, I think, especially in corporate sites. But that made us a little bit nervous in terms of taking control away from the user. And also, you know, we wanted to be sensitive to people who, you know, maybe for whatever reason, they don't want that to happen. So we created a pause button and a play button. You can see this little arrow down here on the left would stop and start the video in the background. Another thing that you can do, which is pretty cool, is to implement motion design only for those users whose experience it's going to enhance. And I'm going to talk about that, I think, in the next slide. Lastly, we have had some success with implementing custom focus states for people who are navigating using a keyboard, or anyone else who relies on focus states to navigate things. And I think, so the default focus state is like a blue, like a faint blue glow, maybe like a 3-pixel blue glow. And as you can see from the screenshot, this is on the Last Call Media site, that wouldn't have shown up here at all. So I think it's really important to thoughtfully design your focus states and make sure that A, they show up, B, they are pretty obvious, and C, that you don't remove them. It used to be really common for people to just remove them because they looked kind of ugly, the default blue glow. And it's not cool to do that anymore. I think most people probably know that by now, but I just felt it was worth mentioning. So designing it intentionally is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I use them all the time. I mean, obviously, I'm a cited user, but you know, tabbing through, entering information on an online order, you can see what box you're in. So you know, it's definitely wider than just someone that's affected by an accessibility issue. It can be a really cool part of your design as well.
Mm-hmm. So I talked about opt-outs. This example is of an opt-out using the reduce motion media query, which is available in CSS and JavaScript. So this happens when so in your OS or in your browser, there's a setting that you can check that says don't show animations. It's a different thing kind of in every OS and browser, but most OSs and browsers have something like that. If you have that enabled, this media query will listen to that setting. And so as a developer, I can say, okay, if this user prefers that their motion is reduced, this will evaluate to true, and then we will have this image effect here that is for specifically removing that animation. You could also do this in a progressive enhancement kind of way. This is more providing a fallback. So, you know, you could just evaluate for the opposite of that. But so in this example, this is the images sliding in from the side of the screen earlier that we showed. And in this case, we're setting the transform to 0. The transform property was what actually controlled the transition of that element, the sliding. So we're setting that to 0, meaning it doesn't happen. And then we're setting the opacity to 1, which means instead of fading in, they just appear. They're just there by default. So that was a way that we could kind of be mindful of that. You can also use this in JavaScript. Here's some jQuery. And so you can use the match media method to, so on the window interface, you can use the match media method and you can query for a specific string media query. So this could be like screen is smaller than 600 pixels, but in this case, since we have prefers reduce motion available for use, we're checking that. And the results of that are going to get put into this matches property. So we can check that, and if it evaluates to false, we can go ahead and do our animations here. So in this case, we are auto playing that background video that I showed earlier that had the pause button, and setting the things so that it does that. So there are some accessibility aside, there are some common pitfalls to look out for when including microinteractions in your projects. And so these are, I think, the most common ones. There are more than this, but obviously, as we've kind of said, you know, if something's purely decorative without thought to usability, it's a good idea to really make sure that it's not going to be in the way. This isn't always bad, but it definitely can be bad. And especially in the case of stakeholders, sometimes stakeholders see a cool, fancy thing and it looks really cool and that's great, but it might not be the right fit for the thing that you're trying to build. So it's important, I think, as web professionals to pick and choose and align them in a way that's consistent and helps the user understand and navigate the site, and then to guide the client and have conversations about what's appropriate and meet their needs, you know, thoughtfully and responsibly. And I think those conversations aren't always easy, but as professionals, we're doing them a service by doing that. We also don't want the microinteractions or motion design to be distracting. I think that one kind of speaks for itself. The third one on here is my big pet peeve, which is scroll jacking. I think this renders a lot of pages unusable. And so if you're not familiar with this term, scroll jacking is when there's a script that instead of you scrolling the mouse or whatever you're using to go down on the page, something intercepts that and then forces you to scroll down like a different amount or scrolls down for you. So like you'll scroll a little bit and like all of a sudden you'll be halfway down the page. And this, I think, started as a trend and was used kind of smartly to navigate between sections, and it made sense, but it's certainly kind of mutated into something that just takes control away from the user, which is no bueno. And Molly, I will let you talk about the last example.
Yeah, this is a good lead into our next section. So failure to pay attention to subtleties in motion design. So you want things to not feel sluggish. You want to make sure that the timing is right. When you open when you open up a menu, you don't want it to feel like it takes forever to drop down, or a confusing experience. Going back to that thing we talked about, consistency. If one thing hovers with an underline and another thing hovers with a shadow, it's a little bit jarring for the user. So just, being thoughtful, having a plan ahead, and again, moving that left in the process really helps with that, so it doesn't feel like an afterthought and you're trying to match something late in the game.
We've got a question. So Lily's asking, what are good questions to ask to distinguish between an attracting or distracting microinteraction? That is a really good question. I would say it's really subjective, and it's going to mean that it's going to come down to your expertise, or people who are on your project team's expertise, probably combined with user testing. I know, Molly, you probably have more sophisticated thoughts about this than I do.
No, I think it's good. I think a good thing is to always ask the client why they want, just genuinely getting them to answer, oh, I think it'll help it stand out. We want the call to action button to stand out more. Okay, so now you found the root of their problem and you can help them solve that together, rather than just being like, okay, that looks cool, I'll do that. So, being thoughtful and really trying to get to the root of what they're trying to do and why they want that. Sometimes it might just be that it looks cool, but thinking about what you're implementing and making sure that it has a goal, I guess, is important too. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to use, accessibility is good there too. You don't want to use colors that are, that can be a good way to honestly roll some stuff out. You can say, I'm sorry, that color doesn't have adequate contrast. And a lot of times that can be your best friend, is looking it up and having a solid reason as to why it's not good for users beyond just like, oh, we don't like it, or, oh, it might be distracting. On paper, it does fail for AAA or whatever. So.
Yeah, I will say in general, that's a really good point. Like in general, I think sometimes as designers, we can get kind of frustrated when we have to conform to what seem like really austere accessibility requirements. But I think that's actually a good example of positive friction in a system where the guidelines and the not regulations, but the standards, I'll say, are there for a reason, and they can safeguard against a lot of things that probably should not be used. Oh, Chad makes a really good point. Thank you, Chad. He says the personality of microinteractions could align with the voice and tone of your content strategy. So that would be another way to make sure that what you're adding is beneficial, rather than kind of just a fun, distracting thing.
Right. I know I sent that pizza taco example as a cool example, and the tone was certainly not right for this client project we were discussing, but could be fun for last call's site. So yeah, definitely playing off of the existing branding and strategy is really important. All right, so some tools and tips for designing microinteractions and facilitating the design handoff. And that's where that last bullet about, correct timing can lead into some of these tools. So we'll go ahead. The first thing, obviously, I made this the title of the slide, is that people are always more important than tools. Nothing is going to do the work for you. A skilled artist can draw with a pencil just as well as they can draw with an iPad Pro and an Apple Pencil. So having open communication, I think, is very important. Chelsea and I have worked together on some stuff, and we're always talking about it. I'm trying to send her examples, and a lot of this, unfortunately, it's not really quantitative, it's qualitative of how do you want it to feel, and that's something that's best communicated, I think, person to person if your team is small enough. That being said, I mentioned already that I'll send code pen examples. That's a really cool way to find stuff that, you know, they can copy paste and play with and remix, and you can say, you know, I really like the timing on this, or I really like the way it fades in. And so sending a bunch of code pen examples of different things and notes on what you like about each is a really great way to translate from design thinking to the development team. There are also tools where, you know, you can do prototyping. So we've just started using Figma. We're really psyched about it. So I'm just getting into their prototyping tools, but I'm really excited at what I've seen so far. InVision Studio is another one. You take sketch files in there and you can do some of that prototyping and interaction stuff, which is, it's really fun. It's still a little bit of a buggy product, honestly, but it works. And Sketch has some native prototyping tools as well if you don't want to get too crazy with it, but still want to translate. There's always After Effects and Photoshop. You know, if you're coming from a team that's more comfortable designing in a, you know, either a print or a, you know, basically an Adobe environment, those are still effective ways to communicate. And then Zero Height or any sort of documentation tool where you can put down intent, and also tools like Figma and Sketch will share to something like that, and they literally share the code with your developers. So there's really no room for error there, because they can literally copy the timing, they can copy the amount, the pixels right there in the products. Yeah, so there's a good example of the back end of this little thing that we showed you earlier, this hover state in the drop-down menu. And that is what Chelsea sees on the inspect view in InVision.
Yeah, so this is the example for this animation that you're seeing here. And at first, I think if you've worked as a front-end developer, and especially if you like being in CSS and JS, it can be kind of fun to get your hands dirty in refining animations like this and making sure that they feel good, which we've talked about. But it can also be really time consuming. And even if I'm doing something that I think feels and looks good, I'm maybe not doing what the designer originally intended. So using a tool like InVision, we were actually able to save a ton of time and make sure that we were getting it right by just using these properties here that were already laid out. And specifically here, this is copy pastable CSS for this transition. So this took away, that time that I would spend kind of looking at it and being like, okay, is it a millisecond? No, that feels too long. Oh, okay, maybe it's 500 milliseconds. No, it seems too short. And figuring that out, or figuring out the easing, it just takes that guesswork away.
That being said, I think sometimes as a designer, you feel like you're in a bit of a vacuum, and it's easy to get, kind of your head in the sand about this stuff, to just keep using metaphors. But, you're looking at it day after day, over and over, analyzing. And sometimes, Chelsea will implement it and I'll be like, ooh, that does feel a little bit slow. So again, keeping that communication open. And, you can always change it in development and update. You always want to update your documentation as well if you do make those changes after. But.
Mm-hmm. I will add another thing that there's not a note about this, I think, in the deck, but I do want to mention it. If you're working with a pattern library or a design system, that can, again, well, I guess I did mention that earlier, but that can, again, be a really good way to test your things in the wild. So something like Pattern Lab or a tool like that, where you can actually interact with the coded version of the animation in the browser. And so that way you're not seeing it in a vacuum or watching it, on a loop over and over again. I mean, maybe that's not a very common use case. And then Chad has pasted some really good, helpful references to, this looks like articles about timing. So feel free to check those out. The psychology of speed, that sounds cool.
Yeah, I saw once that all the waiting, the ... dots on sites when you hit submit are just to make us feel better that they processed our information.
Yeah, there's a thing, I think a lot of mobile apps do this, where you, let's say I submitted an Instagram post, but I have a poor internet connection. I'm seeing something that looks like my post has been posted long before my post is actually posted. There's a name for that practice that I'm not thinking of. I bet someone in the room knows it.
Oh man, that would be a bummer. Why am I not getting any likes?
Well, the idea is that eventually you do go somewhere with better connection at some point. Yeah, so we are at the end. If anyone has any questions, further questions, I should say, or wants to chit chat, we've got, let's see, we started at 2:15, so we've got about 10 minutes. Sorry, 3:15 for East Coast folks. So we've got about 12 minutes if people want to stick around. Otherwise, we do have the Design UX room in the Nerd Slack if people want to continue the conversation. It's pretty fun to talk about, and I would certainly like to see what all of you guys have to say and think about this topic. So, yeah.
That was great, you guys. If there are questions, if you'd rather unmute, go right ahead and do that. If it's better than typing. Also, I would remind everybody to please go to nerd.ngo/feedback and give feedback on the session. It was a great job, you guys.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
I have to say, I was just at the accessibility one just before this, and so it was very heartwarming that was such a important feature of what you talked about. That was more than heartwarming. It was validating. It was very good.
Yeah, the one of the panelists was on, I was going to say this to you, Chelsea, when you were talking about the Carroll Center, was from Genuine, and his team uses the Parsons School or something.
Yeah, the
Perkins
School.
Perkins, thank you.
Yeah,
a very similar system of real users, and they were talking about the benefits of that. So yeah, again, big part of the beginning of the process, and I think everyone's beginning to agree on that, or in the middle session of beginning to agree on that.
Which channel did you say the chat, the customer experience chat or the creative chat was going on? Is it in creative?
So
Kelly set up sorry, Chelsea.
We have a room, yeah, Kelly set up a room called Design-UX.
Ah, that one, got it.
So it can be for any of the talks in that track, but yeah.
Okay.
Or really just wherever. I don't know that we're that militant about making sure people say things in the right rooms, but I don't know.
Great. Any other questions or points? No? All right. Well, thank you all very much.